This man's life changed the moment he heard this girl sing. This story takes turns that no one could have expected. It is a story that is filled with unanswered questions, but ultimately, it is a story that shows the determination of one man to solve his own mystery. Kenneth Baker was a hard-working businessman who was popular in the business sector as someone knowledgeable and very good at solving the biggest problems companies faced. He was able to sit in a room, read reports, and just like that, find problems as well as solutions. This quick thinking made him very successful as he climbed up the corporate ladder. For most of his life, Kenneth had not been in any trouble with the law, but it seemed after his marriage to his wife, Gwen, trouble came knocking on every door. Only 2 years after Kenneth and his wife got married, Gwen seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. It was a strange case in the town and it put a stain on Kenneth's reputation, mainly because everyone thought he had something to do with her disappearance. His only saving alibi was that he was out of town the night she disappeared at a business conference where a lot of people saw him all night and could vouch for him. Irrespective of this, many, including the police, believed that he had something to do with the disappearance and used his business trip as a perfect cover so he could never get caught. As there was no evidence against him, the police had no choice but to let Kenneth go back to his normal life, and since there was no body of the wife, she was never announced to be dead. Soon after, the trial went cold and people stopped looking for her. Kenneth, on the other hand, never really stopped. He tried to move on, assume the worst and focus on his life. Moreover, he and his wife had a daughter together. It was hard for Kenneth to keep his head above water and focus on raising his daughter because he was still trying to look for his wife, work hard to provide for his daughter, and raise her in a town where a lot of people thought he was guilty of a crime he did not commit. A few more years had passed and Kenneth's daughter was now 6 years old. Her name was Daisy and she was a daddy's girl. Kenneth spoiled her with anything she wanted and he was very protective of her. He never let her play by herself or wander off. He worked hard to be able to afford private tutors to come to his house and teach his daughter, as he did not want to send her to school away from him. He was always anxious about the safety of his daughter and could never shake the feeling that something bad might happen to her. Every nanny and tutor had been vetted and checked by Kenneth and a private investigator Kenneth had hired when he was searching for his wife. On days when Kenneth had to be at work or travel for a work-related trip, he wanted to know that his precious little girl was safe. Whatever had happened to his wife still haunted him, and he would do anything to make sure that Daisy was safe. Some weeks later, Kenneth took time off work so he could devote all his attention to his daughter. Their bond was really special. They would play together, make up silly stories, play dress-up, and make up songs. There was a particular song that Kenneth and Daisy made up on one of their dad and daughter playdates. It was called the Flower Song, and it was about a small little flower that grew all alone in a field of grass. Even when the wind blew and the bees buzzed, the flower, which was a daisy, still grew and grew. It was a very unique and silly song, but Daisy loved that song. She sang it everywhere she went. She sang it while she played, took a bath, or did her homework. Sometimes Daisy wished she had friends she could play with, so she could teach them the flower song. But when she was lonely, she would sing the flower song to her teddy bears. Kenneth looked on with a sad look on his face. This wasn't the type of life he wanted for his daughter, but he had no other choice. He had to keep her safe. The next day, the two were sitting on the kitchen table while eating ice cream straight from the tub. It was a hot summer day and Daisy was bored at home. "I want to go out, Daddy. Please, let's go for a picnic," Daisy asked her dad with pleading eyes. Kenneth was already saying no before she finished her sentence, but Daisy stuck out her lower lip and tears welled in her eyes like she was about to cry. This was something Kenneth could not say no to, so he agreed and packed some food and blankets for the picnic. The two drove to a picnic spot by the river's edge. There was a shading of trees that was perfect for a picnic setup. Very soon, Kenneth and Daisy were seated eating their sandwiches. When they were done, Daisy wandered near the river. She peered at the flowing water. "Daisy, get back from there, please," the father yelled in a frustrated voice. It was not safe for her to be so close to the river. It was flowing pretty fast today and wasn't exactly shallow. Kenneth marched over to his daughter and asked her to step away. At first, the little girl, being only 6 years old and thought she could get her way, shook her head and stayed very close to the edge of running water. Kenneth was getting even more frustrated and tired. "Listen to me, Daisy, right now." He yelled at his daughter and pulled her away from the edge of the river. He had not meant to yell so loud at his daughter. He hadn't even realized how loud he was until he noticed other families staring at him. He got Daisy back to their spot in the shade of trees and noticed that his daughter was very quiet. He immediately apologized for yelling and explained he was just trying to keep her safe. Daisy smiled at her dad and promised not to go near the water again. The two played a few more games together before Kenneth began to feel extremely sleepy. He knew he had been working a lot lately and not getting enough sleep, but this didn't explain why he suddenly felt overcome with sleep. He fought to keep his eyes open, but in the end he gave in and shut them for only a moment, or so he thought. When Kenneth woke up, he was alarmed at the sun setting in front of him. How long had he been asleep? He jumped up abruptly when he couldn't hear the sound of Daisy. He looked around him. Her toys were still here, apart from her favorite toy bunny. He walked towards the river. Oh no, it couldn't possibly be. Daisy's tiny shoes were at the edge of the river, but she was nowhere to be found. Kenneth immediately began to panic. There was no way his daughter would have gone close to the river. She had promised not to. Kenneth immediately called the police, telling them the situation. Soon enough, detectives, firefighters, medics, and search and rescue were underway trying to look for Daisy. While the search was going on, two detectives spoke to Kenneth, who was visibly distressed. He just kept muttering over and over. He knew something bad was going to happen. This alarmed the police, but they remained calm while they asked him questions. "So how long were you asleep, sir?" one of the officers asked him. I don't know. It felt like only a few minutes. I don't even remember falling asleep. Something's not right." Kenneth could barely get his words out. He was a mess. Some of the other family said they overheard you yelling at your daughter. "What were you yelling at her about?" the detective asked. Kenneth could not believe this line of questioning. They should be out there checking every possible corner of this place, not asking him about his parenting. He explained that he only scolded his daughter for getting too close to the river because it wasn't safe. The police took more notes from his questions until they were finished with the initial questioning. For the next few days, Kenneth and the search and rescue team did their best to find Daisy, but they were unable to. The only thing they found was her favorite toy bunny, which had washed up on another site. This led the police to believe that something horrible had happened to Daisy that day at the river. They feared she had drowned. As soon as this new piece of evidence turned up, all fingers pointed to Kenneth. Given the previous case of his disappearing wife, the investigating team were more critical of him. They cooked up this theory that Kenneth was tired of playing the role of husband and father, so he set up a plan to get rid of his family, starting with his wife and then his child. It was the police's working theory, but since there was no evidence to support any of these allegations, they could not charge him with child abuse by way of neglect, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. This news traveled fast, and everyone in the town believed he had gotten rid of his daughter, just like they believed he had gotten rid of his wife. Over the 10 years Kenneth spent in prison, he only had one visitor, his private investigator. Since the police did not believe him, he knew they would not help him prove his innocence. Kenneth told his PI every detail he could remember from that day. Everything seemed normal until he left the picnic spot they had set up and walked over to the water's edge to pull Daisy away. And they had returned, played more games, ate their food and drinks, and he had slept off. Kenneth kept insisting that he had nothing to do with what happened to Daisy. His PI believed him. He saw the way Kenneth loved his daughter. He didn't think he would ever do anything to harm her, so he promised to help. It was a difficult 10 years in prison, but Kenneth kept to himself. The only thing that kept him going was the hope that his daughter was not dead, but somewhere, and he was going to find her. When Kenneth was finally released, he felt like there was nothing left to the man he used to be. He had lost everything, and the world was a different place from how he left it. He got to work with the private investigator, but he had no money to pay for the services. Kenneth then started to sell the possessions he had from his previous life to get by. It was difficult to get a job with a criminal conviction, especially when the whole town thought he had done something worse to his family other than neglect his daughter. Nevertheless, the private investigator didn't care about how the rest of the town saw Kenneth. He knew the man was innocent and agreed to help him find his daughter without any further costs. He even offered him a job as his assistant. And so the two began their investigation into the disappearance of Daisy. They went back to the picnic site by the river where Kenneth had last seen his daughter over 10 years ago. As soon as Kenneth saw the familiar place that haunted his dreams, he was overcome with despair. Tears poured from his eyes. The town had put up a beautiful bench in the area where they had been camping, and around the bench were flowers, daisies in particular. They had done this in memory of his daughter. Tell me exactly how that day went, where the both of you were until the unfortunate incident. The private investigator asked Kenneth to recount his steps, and so he did. Kenneth showed the PI how they sat and ate lunch and played in the grass with her toys. He showed when Daisy ran off and exactly where she was at the edge of the river. How long were you both here when you were telling her not to go near the water? The PI asked. Probably 5 minutes or a little more. She insisted on not listening, so I had to tell her several times before we finally walked back to our picnic basket, Kenneth replied. He then continued telling the story. They played for a little while longer, and he suddenly felt so sleepy. He tried to fight it, but he couldn't. Then he woke up and she was gone. The PI found this strange. He thought it was strange that Kenneth felt fine, and then all of a sudden he felt extremely sleepy. He asked Kenneth if he had had food or drink with him that day. Yes, it was a picnic. Of course we had food and drinks. We ate our food before Daisy ran off, and I finally brought her back to the picnic site. All I had was some water that I left laying around. The private investigator scribbled more things down on his notepad. He told Kenneth to go home and wait for his call. He had to do something, and it wasn't exactly legal. Kenneth went home and waited by his cell phone. He did not hear from his PI for days and was beginning to think that whatever he had gone to do had gotten him in trouble. The next day, his phone rang. It was the private investigator asking to meet at the office. Kenneth hurriedly went there as his voice sounded like he had found a break in the investigation. At the office, the PI opened the door eagerly and ushered Kenneth into his private office. On the desk, there was evidence bags from 10 years ago. Kenneth didn't want to ask how the PI got this evidence from the police custody. There were the remains of the lunch Kenneth and his daughter had that day: sweet wrappers, juice boxes, and water bottles. The PI began to explain how he thought Kenneth's story was odd, especially because he seemed fine until he and his daughter returned to their picnic site, which meant Kenneth had left their food unattended for at least 5 minutes. The PI managed to get the food and drinks from the police evidence lockup and tested all items for any drugs. Because the items were over 10 years old, it was hard to find good samples, but the water bottle Kenneth had been drinking had traces of a type of drug that makes someone sleep if they consume it in high doses. Kenneth, you were drugged that day. That's why you fell asleep and everything was so strange. Someone watched you and Daisy step away from your food and drugged you. Kenneth could not believe his ears. He had been drugged. It all made sense. His only worry was that his daughter had been drugged too. He asked the PI about this, and he said the traces were only found on Kenneth's water bottle and nothing else. With this new information, Kenneth was eager to take it to the police. Maybe then they could reopen the investigation on his daughter. But the PI warned him against this. The police already believed he did this. They were not going to change their minds, especially as the evidence was stolen from right under them. So Kenneth and the PI had no choice but to investigate by themselves. Months went by and no new leads came about. It seemed that there was no way to trace the drug found in the water. Kenneth had lost hope and wondered if he would ever get closure with this part of his life. This was one of the hardest days where he felt depressed. On days like these, he would go to a flower shop and look at the daisies. Because of how everyone in the town treated him, Kenneth mostly drove to a flower shop in a town further away so he wouldn't get recognized. What happened next was unbelievable. Kenneth was looking at a different flower shop on display. his mind heavy with thoughts of his daughter. Just then, he heard a familiar tune that transported him back to 10 years ago, before his life turned upside down. It was the flower song, the song he and his daughter had made up all those years ago. He could never forget that song. He sang it every day in prison for 10 years. He followed the sound of the voice until he came face to face with the girl. He stopped in his tracks. She had her eyes. She looked like a combination of Daisy and his wife. "What song is that?" he asked as blood rushed from his face. The teenage girl's eyes widened in surprise at the abrupt question, but there was no flicker of recognition on her face. "It's just a silly song I made up. It's called the flower song. I'm not sure how I know the song." She laughed at herself and the expression on Kenneth's face. Just as Kenneth was about to ask her more questions, a strange man came behind her and put his arm around her shoulder. He was wearing linen clothes and had bushy hair. Kenneth noticed that the young girl was also wearing similar linen clothes. More concerning was that they both wore matching necklaces with a heavy pendant that had a strange symbol. "Come now, Luna, we must go," the man said to the girl before guiding her away. Kenneth's heart was beating so quickly as he watched the two of them walk away. He didn't know how he knew, but deep within him, he believed that this to be his daughter. Immediately, Kenneth drove back to his town and went straight to the PI's office, and he began telling him all the things he saw. He described the necklace in detail. "I think I know what you're talking about," the PI said, and typed on his computer for a minute before turning the screen to Kenneth. "Yes, that's him. That's the man I saw." The PI told Kenneth that this man ran some type of religious cult where he and his followers lived in a remote compound. Kenneth wondered whether it was now enough evidence to take to the police, but still, the PI declined. He said they needed concrete evidence. Once again, the PI told Kenneth to go home and wait for his call. This time, the PI did not call Kenneth. He came straight to his house a few days later. Kenneth opened the door and the PI waved around a handful of papers. He spread the papers all over the floor. "I think we've got him," the PI said. As Kenneth walked closer to the papers, he realized that they were pictures. Pictures with date and timestamps of the religious cult in the remote compound. He looked through all of them until he gasped. His wife was there too. He picked up the photo of his wife and stared at it for a long time. His wife was with his daughter. They were sitting together arranging flowers. "Now we can take it to the police," the PI said. And so Kenneth took the photo evidence to the police. After telling them the story of what happened at the flower shop, the police knew they could not ignore the strong piece of evidence, and so they went to work and raided the compound, where they rescued Daisy as well as many other missing women from around the neighboring towns. They arrested the leader and some of his older followers who helped in kidnapping the younger ones. This included Kenneth's wife. She was arrested for aiding and abetting a kidnapping. After much psychological evaluation, the court found her to have been heavily influenced and under some type of drugs for the most part, and since she had also been kidnapped years ago, the court didn't send her to prison, but rather to a hospital to be treated. Daisy was also sent to a psychiatric facility, where she and several other girls who were rescued received help, as many of them could not remember their old life. One day while Kenneth was visiting, he brought along some of Daisy's toys from her childhood, including the toy bunny. When he sat across from her, he held back tears because she could not remember him. He pulled out her favorite book and then her favorite toy, and he began to sing the flower song to her. He sang it over and over again. Suddenly, something in Daisy's eyes changed. She recognized the toy and the book. She recognized the man sitting in front of her. She grabbed his hands. "Dad," she said with tears in her eyes. Kenneth was too emotional to speak, so all he could do was nod as they both sang that silly flower song together.